Across vast regions of Africa and Asia, elephants move through forests and savannas with a familiarity that feels timeless. Their presence is obvious, their size impossible to miss, and yet, the most important things they do are rarely seen, rarely measured, and almost never noticed in real time. Elephants are usually described in simple terms. The largest land mammals on Earth. Intelligent, social, iconic. But within natural systems, they are something far more subtle. They are not merely inhabitants of these environments. They are agents of change. Forces that quietly shape how forests grow, how water moves, and how life reorganizes itself over decades. In many ecosystems, elephants influence the structure of vegetation without intention or design. Trees fall, paths open, soil shifts, and water collects or disappears. Not because elephants seek to alter the land, but because the land responds to their presence. These changes accumulate slowly. They do not announce themselves with sudden collapse or dramatic events. Instead, they unfold over years, sometimes generations, until the environment begins to behave differently. What makes this role difficult to recognize is its invisibility. Forests do not fail the moment elephants leave. Rivers do not vanish overnight. The consequences emerge gradually, often attributed to climate, chance, or unrelated pressures. The true cause remains hidden in plain sight. To understand elephants, it is not enough to observe their behavior. We must examine the systems that have evolved around them, and the quiet dependencies that form when a single species becomes embedded in the functioning of an entire ecosystem. To understand this animal, we must understand the system it operates within. In many forested regions where elephants live, the physical structure of the landscape is not the result of passive growth. It is shaped by repeated interaction between vegetation and large-bodied movement. Elephants contribute to this structure through actions that are neither deliberate nor strategic, but consistent enough to produce system-level effects over time. As elephants move through dense forest, they break branches, push over young trees, and create open corridors simply by walking, feeding, and traveling between water sources. These disturbances are localized and incremental. A single broken sapling or fallen branch appears insignificant in isolation. However, when repeated across large areas and over many years, these actions prevent forests from becoming uniformly dense. Instead of forming closed canopies with limited light penetration, elephant-influenced forests develop layers of vegetation with varying heights and densities. This structural variation alters how energy and resources move through the ecosystem. Sunlight reaches the forest floor more frequently, supporting grasses, shrubs, and low-growing plants that would otherwise be shaded out. These plants, in turn, provide food and habitat for insects, small mammals, and ground-dwelling birds. The result is not destruction, but diversification. The forest becomes a mosaic rather than a wall. Other species respond directly to this altered structure. Browsing animals benefit from increased access to young vegetation. Predators adjust their hunting patterns in response to new sightlines and movement corridors. Even plant species that are not consumed by elephants are affected, as competition for light, water, and nutrients shifts in subtle but measurable ways. Environmental pressures limit this function. In areas where elephant populations are reduced or confined, vegetation density increases beyond historical norms. Young trees survive in higher numbers, understory plants decline, and forest structure becomes more uniform. While this may initially appear as recovery or regeneration, ecological observations indicate that excessive density can reduce overall biodiversity and resilience. When the structural influence of elephants weakens, the system does not fail immediately. Instead, it slowly reorganizes around new constraints. Species adapted to open or mixed environments decline, while others expand. The forest remains standing, but its internal dynamics change. Stability becomes more fragile, and the system's ability to absorb external stress, such as drought or fire, is reduced. In this way, Elephants function as regulators of physical space. Their presence maintains structural balance, not through dominance, but through continuous, low-intensity interaction with their surroundings. This balance does not depend on intention. It depends on consistency, and when that consistency is removed, the effects ripple outward, reshaping the ecosystem long after the animals themselves are gone. In ecosystems shaped by seasonal rainfall and extended dry periods, access to water determines which species persist and which disappear. Elephants influence this balance through behaviors that alter how water is stored, accessed, and redistributed across the landscape. These effects are rarely direct or immediately visible, but they accumulate through repeated interaction with terrain and vegetation. As elephants travel between feeding areas and water sources, they follow routes that gradually deepen into channels. In riverbeds and dry stream corridors, their weight compresses soil and shifts sediment, slowing surface runoff during periods of rain. In some regions, elephants dig into sandy riverbanks or dry channels to access subsurface moisture. These excavations create shallow wells that hold water longer into the dry season, not only for elephants, but for many other species that rely on the same sources. Vegetation modified by elephants also affects water dynamics. By reducing tree density and opening canopy cover, evaporation patterns change. Rainfall reaches the ground more evenly rather than being intercepted and lost through dense foliage. Water infiltrates soil more effectively, replenishing groundwater instead of running off quickly. Over time, this contributes to the persistence of small wetlands, seasonal pools, and moist soil zones that support plant and animal life during periods of scarcity. Other species respond to these conditions in predictable ways. Herbivores congregate near remaining water points. Predators adjust their territories around these areas. Birds, amphibians, and insects concentrate in zones where moisture remains available. These patterns are not coordinated responses to elephants themselves, but reactions to environmental conditions that elephants help maintain. There are limits to this function. In areas where elephants are excluded or their numbers decline sharply, water retention decreases, riverbeds compact differently, vegetation thickens along banks, and access points disappear. Seasonal water sources dry earlier each year. The change is gradual and often attributed to rainfall variability or climate trends. Even when precipitation levels remain within historical ranges, when this water-regulating role weakens, ecosystems become more vulnerable to extremes. Droughts intensify, not because less rain falls, but because water moves through the system too quickly. Species that depend on prolonged moisture face increased stress, and competition intensifies around fewer remaining sources. The system adapts, but with reduced flexibility. Through these indirect processes, elephants act as modifiers of hydrological flow. They do not control water in a mechanical sense, but their presence alters how water behaves within the environment. This role operates continuously, without coordination or intent, and its effects become apparent only when the patterns it supports begin to unravel. Fire is a recurring force in many of the environments elephants inhabit, but its behavior is shaped by the structure and composition of vegetation rather than by ignition alone. Elephants influence this process indirectly by altering how plant material accumulates and how fuel is distributed across the landscape. Through regular feeding and movement, elephants reduce the density of woody plants and limit the buildup of continuous vegetation layers. Trees are broken, shrubs are thinned, and grasses are kept in varying states of growth. This creates a heterogeneous landscape where combustible material is unevenly distributed. Fires that occur in such environments tend to move slowly, burn at lower intensity, and extinguish naturally when they encounter gaps or less flammable zones. This pattern affects how ecosystems recover after fire. Low-intensity burns clear old growth without damaging root systems or soil structure. Nutrients are returned to the ground, and regeneration begins quickly. Plant species adapted to periodic disturbance thrive under these conditions, maintaining diversity and preventing any single type of vegetation from dominating the system. When elephant influence diminishes, these dynamics change. vegetation becomes denser and more uniform, particularly in transitional zones between forest and grassland. Fine fuels, such as dry grasses, accumulate alongside woody debris. Under these conditions, fires spread more rapidly and burn hotter. Instead of clearing selectively, they can damage mature trees, sterilize soil layers, and alter plant communities in ways that take decades to reverse. Other species are affected by this shift. Animals adapted to patchy, post-burn environments lose habitat. Insect populations fluctuate unpredictably. Predators face changes in prey availability as fire-sensitive species decline. These effects are not caused by fire itself, but by the altered conditions under which fire now operates. Environmental constraints further influence this role. Climate variability, changes in land use, and human fire management practices interact with vegetation patterns shaped by elephant presence or absence. In systems where elephants once moderated fuel loads, their removal increases reliance on external control measures to prevent large-scale fires. At the system level, elephants contribute to fire regulation by maintaining balance rather than suppression. Their continuous interaction with vegetation limits extremes and supports a cycle of disturbance and recovery that sustains ecosystem stability. When this regulatory function weakens, fire shifts from a renewing force to a destabilizing one, reshaping landscapes in ways that persist long after the flames are gone. Changes in vegetation structure, water availability, and fire behavior do not remain isolated within a single layer of the ecosystem. They propagate outward, influencing species that may never directly interact with elephants. These cascading effects unfold gradually, following ecological relationships rather than linear cause and effect. As elephants maintain open spaces and mixed vegetation zones, smaller herbivores gain access to a wider range of forage. Grazers benefit from grasses that thrive in sunlit clearings, while browsers exploit regenerating shrubs and young trees. This diversity of feeding opportunities reduces direct competition and allows multiple species to coexist within the same area. When these conditions persist, population pressures distribute more evenly across available resources. Predators respond to these patterns by adjusting movement and hunting strategies. Open corridors created by elephant activity alter visibility and travel efficiency. Some predators gain advantages in areas where vegetation is less dense, while others rely on edge zones where forest meets open ground. These adaptations are not driven by elephants themselves, but by the spatial arrangements elephants help sustain. Bird communities are affected through changes in nesting sites, food availability, and microclimates. Increased plant diversity supports a wider range of insects, which in turn supports insectivorous birds. Ground nesting species benefit from open understory, while canopy species adjust to variations in tree density. Amphibians and reptiles respond to moisture retention and temperature gradients shaped by altered vegetation and soil conditions. When elephant influence weakens, these relationships begin to shift. Dense vegetation limits grass growth and reduces habitat heterogeneity. Some herbivore populations decline due to restricted forage, while others concentrate in smaller areas, increasing pressure on remaining resources. Predators follow these changes, often experiencing reduced hunting success or altered territorial ranges. The effects extend to less visible organisms. Soil invertebrates respond to changes in organic matter and moisture. Fungal and microbial communities adjust to altered plant litter and fire regimes. These microscopic shifts influence nutrient cycling, affecting plant growth and resilience across the system. What defines these cascading effects is their subtlety. No single species' disappearance signals the change. Instead, the system gradually reorganizes as ecological connections weaken or strengthen in response to new conditions. The presence of elephants supports a web of interactions that stabilizes these relationships. Their absence allows small imbalances to accumulate, eventually reshaping the ecosystem in ways that are difficult to reverse. In regions where elephant populations decline sharply or disappear entirely, the absence is rarely marked by an immediate ecological collapse. The landscapes remain familiar. Forests still stand. Wildlife persists. Yet beneath this surface continuity, the system begins to function differently, adjusting to the loss of a stabilizing force it had long incorporated. Without the repeated physical disturbance caused by elephants, vegetation density increases steadily. Young trees that would have been broken or suppressed now survive in greater numbers. Shrubs thicken, and open spaces gradually close. This shift alters light distribution, soil temperature, and moisture retention. Species adapted to mixed or open environments lose ground, while others expand into newly available niches. The transition is slow enough that it often goes unnoticed, interpreted as natural succession rather than structural imbalance. Water dynamics change alongside vegetation. Access points once maintained through regular elephant movement degrade or disappear. Seasonal pools dry earlier. Groundwater recharge patterns shift as rainfall interception increases under denser canopies. These changes are subtle and cumulative, becoming apparent only during periods of environmental stress. When water scarcity intensifies beyond expected levels, fire behavior adjusts to these new conditions. Increased fuel continuity supports larger, more intense burns. Fire frequency may decrease, but severity rises when fires do occur. Recovery slows, and plant communities reorganize around species better suited to withstand extreme disturbance. The system becomes more vulnerable to external pressures, including prolonged drought and human land use. No other species fully replaces the functions elephants once provided. Smaller herbivores influence vegetation at different scales. Other large mammals lack the combination of size, mobility, and feeding behavior required to produce comparable effects. The ecosystem adapts, but it adapts around absence, rather than substitution. These adjustments illustrate a broader principle within ecological systems. Stability does not depend solely on the presence of many species, but on the persistence of specific roles. When a role embedded deeply within system processes is removed, the system does not fail outright. It reorganizes into a new state, often one that is less diverse, less flexible, and more sensitive to change. The loss of elephants reveals how ecosystems can continue to function while quietly losing complexity. The visible landscape may appear intact, but the interactions that once buffered variability and distributed pressure weaken. Over time, this altered balance reshapes the environment in ways that reflect not catastrophe, but gradual simplification. 5. The effects described do not operate independently. Vegetation structure, water movement, fire behavior, and species interactions are interlinked processes that respond collectively to the presence or absence of elephants. Each function reinforces the others, creating a system that maintains balance through feedback rather than control. When elephants influence vegetation density, they simultaneously affect how water is absorbed and retained. Changes in water availability then shape plant growth patterns, which in turn influence fuel loads and fire intensity. Fire alters nutrient distribution and soil composition, feeding back into vegetation recovery. These processes overlap continuously, forming a network of interactions rather than a sequence of isolated events. Species responses are embedded within this network. Herbivores track changes in forage availability created by vegetation shifts. Predators respond to prey distribution shaped by water and cover. Smaller organisms, from insects to soil microbes, adjust to changes in moisture, temperature, and organic matter. None of these responses are directed by elephants, yet all are influenced by the conditions elephants help sustain. This interdependence explains why the removal of elephants produces system-wide changes that are difficult to attribute to a single cause. Observations may identify declining water sources, altered fire regimes, or shifting species populations, but the underlying driver remains distributed across multiple processes. The system adapts by reorganizing connections rather than eliminating them, masking the original source of change. Balance in these environments is not a static state. It is a dynamic equilibrium maintained through continuous interaction between physical forces and biological activity. Elephants contribute to this equilibrium by occupying a role that links multiple processes across scales, from soil disturbance to landscape-level structure. When that role weakens, the system does not collapse, but its internal coordination degrades. No single function compensates fully for this loss. Instead, the system fragments into less integrated components, each responding to pressure independently. This fragmentation reduces resilience, making the environment more sensitive to variability and less capable of absorbing disturbance. The result is not immediate failure, but a gradual shift toward instability. No single role operates independently inside this environment. Over extended timeframes, ecosystems shaped by elephants exhibit patterns of stability that are not immediately apparent through short-term observation. These patterns emerge through repeated cycles of disturbance and recovery, allowing the system to adjust gradually to environmental variability. Elephants contribute to this long-term balance by maintaining conditions that support adaptation rather than rigidity. As climate conditions fluctuate, ecosystems influenced by elephants tend to redistribute stress rather than concentrate it. Variations in rainfall are absorbed through diversified vegetation structure and moderated water retention. Periods of drought or increased fire activity do not affect all areas uniformly, reducing the likelihood of widespread failure. This uneven response allows populations to persist locally and recolonize affected zones over time. When elephant populations decline, long-term trends shift subtly but consistently. Vegetation becomes less diverse, and ecological processes become more synchronized, increasing vulnerability to extremes. Droughts produce more severe impacts because water moves through the system too quickly. Fires, when they occur, affect larger areas simultaneously. Recovery slows as fewer refuges remain intact. Human activity interacts with these changes without always being recognized as a secondary factor. Land conversion, resource extraction, and fire suppression can intensify trends already set in motion by the loss of elephant-driven processes. In many cases, observed environmental degradation is attributed solely to human pressure or climate change, while the underlying structural changes caused by species loss remain unexamined. Adaptation still occurs, but along narrower pathways. Species that tolerate uniform conditions expand, while those dependent on variability decline. The ecosystem continues to function, yet its capacity to respond to future change diminishes. Over decades, this results in environments that appear stable until disrupted, at which point recovery becomes increasingly uncertain. These long-term effects illustrate how ecological stability depends on processes that operate quietly and continuously. Elephants do not determine outcomes, but they influence the range of possible responses available to the system. Their role shapes how ecosystems absorb pressure, reorganize after disturbance, and maintain function across generations. Understanding elephants through this perspective requires setting aside familiar narratives and focusing instead on how natural systems organize themselves over time. The influence described here is not dramatic, immediate, or easily observed. It is embedded in structure, flow, and interaction. By examining these processes, it becomes possible to see how a single species can shape outcomes far beyond its visible presence. Which part of this system surprised you the most? The way forests restructure, how water persists through dry seasons, or how fire behavior changes without direct intervention? And are there other species whose roles might be just as deeply embedded, yet equally overlooked? Within the ecosystems they inhabit,